Welcome to Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Heyman, the podcast where we dive deep into the habits, mindsets, and strategies that set top financial advisors apart. I'm Scott Tatum, and today I'll be talking with Ken to explore his thoughts on a checklist for high-functioning teams. Before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to an important service from our sponsor, Total Family. If you're working with ultra high net worth clients and you find yourself stuck when it comes to getting families engaged in conversations about wealth and legacy, Total Family offers a platform advisors can offer to their clients. Go check them out at totalfamily.io. That is totalfamily.io. Again, let's get our listeners in the right frame of mind. You can't delve deeply into the psyche of clients while dwelling in our busy world. So let's leave the outside world behind for 25 minutes and look deep inside human behavior to explore the science of clients, setting instincts aside so that insights can guide. And Ken, the insights we're talking about today are not insights of clients so much, it's insights of the advisors. And this is the second part of a two-part podcast. Last time, we really got into what drove us to want to talk about this topic. What have you observed in the dynamics of teams that you thought necessitated this discussion?
It's just a great place to start, Scott, because I don't think you could repeat these ideas too many times in financial services. Financial services was designed to hold up and honor these heroic individual performers, the sole practitioner. Very much, it still has a culture that's rooted back into the experience you and I both started in the industry with, which was that transactional salesperson stockbroker. Now, we've grown past that, and we're certainly holistic wealth advisors now for the most part, those who are the great ones that are building wonderful businesses. But the industry still carries that cultural preference for honoring the individual. In the modern era, as teams are formed, the big challenge for teams is to have guiding principles or organizing principles that help them do the thing and build the team and operate the team as a team. And so the two big principles that we covered in our last conversation, first was a team has a shared sense of mission. We are doing something larger than ourselves. We are targeting specific types of clients. We are offering a specific set of solutions. We have a sense of a value proposition. This mission idea organizes us together as a group, as a unit. It's not me and you and you and you. It's us on a mission and contributing our energies to the mission. I remember years ago, my youngest daughter was part of a rowing team, a crew team in her high school. And the biggest challenge for a crew team was to maintain that sense of a single entity in a boat heading in the same direction and each person contributing their part of it, but very aware that there's a larger organizing principle that's going to make this work. The other idea is efficient institution. And I think that's really hard for a lot of advisors to get. Advisors live a lot in the moment, in the tactics of the moment. When an advisor's working, they're working one-on-one in a private conversation with a client. But running a business in a highly competitive arena where fees are challenging at times, that clients have increasing awareness that they have power over influencing fees. This requires an institution that's functioning efficiently, not just an institution that exists, but is doing things efficiently so that it can be productive and reward its participants, its members. So the achievement of efficiency means thinking about process and using processes that enable these individual humans to coordinate, to act, but to act in such a way they get a lot of benefit, a lot of productivity for the effort they're putting in. So if you can just start with this sense of this overarching sense of mission and this sense that we're building an institution, by the way, in a world where private equity is driving up the value of teams, and for individuals who are within eyesight of an exit, building an institution that runs like an institution, that is sustainable like an institution, that's not the expression of an individual hero, but is an expression of a coordinated effort, that is a highly saleable entity. In fact, what we're seeing now and what we're being asked to do, as you know, more and more, is helping these independent teams. A lot of in the RIA space is very prevalent, but also the top teams in some of our more organizational expressions to think about institutionalization, because the value that the private equity is looking for is an institution that's going to continue to function and grow at a high level. That doesn't happen with heroic individuals. It happens with a well-functioning, well-oiled machine called an institution. So you stick those two things together and some external stuff happening that really requires this. That's the starting point for building something. Now, the building is a more moment-by-moment, issue-by-issue process, but those two guiding principles really are the root of where you start.
And therein lies the concept of this checklist. And most teams, Ken, we've both seen this, often start off as individual practices that kind of operate side by side. And then they start a journey. And that journey is we're going to go from these individual practices, and we're going to start to move toward that mission. We're going to start to move toward that feeling of institutional efficiency. We're going to go from being individual practices to being a single business. And so the checklist can help you understand where you are on that journey and in what areas might you want to concentrate. And on the first part of this, you covered the first three items of that checklist. The first one you did was that business that has a shared mission and functions with those institutional mandates has a standard of care. In other words, there are items, directions that the business has as to how we treat clients, how we manage meetings, et cetera. You then went from that the business would second have an opinion about how financial plans are used. Well, of course, the individual practitioners use financial planning, but this would be a shared vision. This is how we use the software. This is how often we present it to clients. This is how we present it to clients and how we use it with clients. And then the third element that was covered in part one was a shared view of the capital markets. And that's one that's quite challenging because traditionally every advisor comes with their own opinions about the capital markets and the way that they view the markets and what experts they lean on. And so it's a sign of moving together when a team can say, this is our shared version, and this is how we're going to present the capital markets to all of our clients. So those were the first three that you covered last time, but that's not the end of the list. Where do we go from there?
Well, that's a good point, Scott. So when you're thinking about creating an efficient institution, you have to look at the institution you have and say, okay, where are we doing well? And by the way, what do we mean by well? And where do we need to invest effort, energy, and change to move toward that goal of efficiency? So to your point, a standard of care is how we memorialize, how we externalize and memorialize what our actual value deliverables are to the client. And what it is the content of what we provide, so we can manage it, so we can determine how are we doing with each client. Is each client getting the full measure of our standard of care? The same thing is true with the capital markets perspective. Do we all operate according to the same rich perspective on that? If every advisor is investing an hour or two a week, 3 or 4 hours a week, okay, use AI and you can burn it down to 30 minutes to an hour a week, and constructing their own capital markets perspective, you don't have an institutional perspective. You need a source for that everyone agrees upon, that's going to be our stated perspective. And obviously financial planning, the root of that really goes back to our understanding of what are clients hiring advisors for? They're hiring advisors to answer a fundamental question. Can you give me confidence the future I want is the future I'm going to get? The resonance of that question goes deep because it informs, questions like that inform, okay, what are we supposed to be doing? Now, if you look at our checklist, the fourth item on the checklist is this idea of an institutionalized asset management model. Now, this is the one area where I am aware I'm being very provocative. It's also the one area I'm most confident that the great teams are doing and their institutions are benefiting from. Instead of every client-facing, relationship managing advisor constructing their own asset management model, the client-facing relationship management advisor interprets the asset management model that they're using with the client, but that model is built efficiently using available tools so that the entire organization can talk about in a coherent way what we're doing for our clients. We have this capital markets point of view, and we have an asset management approach. Now, obviously, in the modern era, an asset management approach that's institutionalized can be very resilient, can provide lots of different expressions of risk management and pace of performance expected and how we deploy capital according to the preferences of the client. There's nothing hard about developing a multifaceted asset management model. But what it does is it takes all this activity of the advisor away from the behind the scenes stuff and allows them to redeploy their time, effort, and energy, interest, and skills into the actual relationship management. And the point of that is the whole purpose of an advisor working with a client-facing advisor, is to create and curate experiences that feed the client emotionally what they need to have peace of mind, a sense of confidence, a sense of liberation from the anxieties of uncertainty, so they can go about the life they're living. The one life they have, as David Loper says, live the best way they can. The advisor has a role there. I think there's a seduction that many advisors have that says, well, if I'm not actually creating the asset management model, that somehow something's missing and the client will feel like I'm not very, very effective. Nothing could be further than the truth. The client doesn't care where that model comes from or who builds it. In fact, an institutionally built model that can be described and explained and reported on richly by the advisor who's interpreting it to the client can feel extremely personal and extremely qualitative. And of course, as it functions well over time, can be incredibly empowering to the relationship. But it's so powerful in creating efficiencies. Instead of a whole bunch of humans running around reinventing the wheel, it liberates them to take action. And in a similar way, and again, it shades into the fifth principle or the fifth observing trait, these great institutions have an institutionalized servicing and communication model so that each part of the organization, each relationship manager, client-facing advisor has a model that supports and strengthens and informs how they develop the relationship with the client. And so I want to go back to this idea because I think the words can feel slippery in the mind of the advisor. They can get lost in some of this interpretation. The entire job of the financial advisor, the client-facing financial advisor, can be understood as curating a series of experiences that builds trust in the advisor and what the advisor's doing. Curating experiences. So if we understand what the client's looking for, they want evidence that the future they want, you understand it and you have the ability to get them there. They want to know that you're paying attention to their life and are speaking to the issues as your life presents opportunities for them to be of service, as your life presents new challenges that need to be addressed. Are you paying attention to the world and do you know what to do about it? As the world shifts and turns, are we paying attention to that? And does our asset management model and our servicing model embrace that? All of this comes back down to expertise. High net worth and ultra high net worth clients surround themselves with experts. To the extent that the advisor is curating these experiences and interpreting what they're doing, whether not that they built something, but they're interpreting what they're using to serve the client across all these areas, their life, the world around, the future that they want. Now you're starting to talk about very intentional process. But if the institution of the practice builds that, then the advisor isn't having to invent it or fly by the seat of their pants. They know how often they're calling the client. They know what that call should be about. When the client calls in, they know how to curate the experience that the client's looking for. They have a vision that informs their performance. Now, I know that sounds daunting and it takes a little bit of time, but if you think about looking at your business and saying, okay, there's these 5 big areas. There's our standard of care of solutions. There's our asset management model. There's our financial planning model. There's our servicing model. There's our perspective on the capital markets. All of a sudden you realize, hey, if we're missing one of those, we can work on that. We can install an approach to talking about the capital markets, and our team can master that. And then we can move on to the next and the next. And that's really the power of this kind of checklist, Scott, that it gives an advisor handles to grab a hold of their business and say, okay, this area is what we need to be focused on.
And clients, I think advisors think that clients are going to be resistant to this. If we look at other parts of our society, we see this work. I've always thought about the putting together the portfolio as analogous in the medical world to filling a prescription. And we're old guys, so we've got to go to the CVS. We don't want to walk into our CVS and you don't want to hear your pharmacist say, "Ken, I'm going to go mix you up a fresh batch." And they pull out the mortar and pestle and just start, compounding things right in front of you. We would think of that as unsettling. We want there to be a standardized approach. We don't need them to manufacture our prescription locally. There's no farm to table prescriptions, right? I think we're used to it. I think it's the same thing in the communication model. Again, if you go look in the medical industry, 30-year-olds do not expect to be on a every 6 month cadence with a doctor, but 60 and 70-year-olds do. We understand that those meeting cadences and service models evolve as our needs evolve, and we're used to it. We're just not used to it in this industry. So if you look at those places for standardization and you kind of appreciate the fact that clients will be very accepting of this, are there other places that you really look for, opportunities for a checklist, or are those the key areas?
Well, these are the big five, obviously. And I know you belabor it in your work, and I certainly do in mine, because so often we talk to advisors who insist that they need to be the ones touching the money and making the decisions about that. And I just think there's a seduction there. And to your point, those advisors who have released that, or those institutions that have released that, achieve so much more efficiency, so much more frequency of contact, and so much more quality of contact. So those big five, the servicing model, the asset management model, planning model, et cetera. But if you get now into the management of the organization and how the organization manages itself and grows itself, there's five more attributes that I think deserve some attention here just for a few minutes. And again, the idea here is these give you handles. They give you handles that you can grab a hold of the business and decide what we're going to do about it. So again, in no particular order, these highly efficient teams have roles that each member of the team is fulfilling. And you can think of a role as a combination or an aggregation of methodologies. In the highly efficient team, there's individuals whose design is to build portfolios, right? And that's an aggregation of methodology. There are others whose actions are to manage client relationships. That's an aggregation of methodologies that can be learned and executed. And as soon as an organization starts to understand that this idea of roles are aggregations of methods are processes that can be described and then executed systematically over and over again, now you start having the ability to manage your human capital so that you have roles of client support in terms of that administrative support. You have roles in terms of relationship management. You have roles in terms of asset management. You have perhaps even roles in terms of advanced financial planning. That's an individual comes in with expertise with that client in support of the relationship. There's so many iterations of this, but really thinking through, what are we providing to our clients? How do we want to provide that to our clients? What's the human capital need to do that for our clients? And how do we distribute that vision of our standard of care and our servicing model and our asset management model across our human capital? Now, does that sound easy? No, it's not.
No.
But is it manageable over time if you're seeking efficiency? It is. And this allows you to focus on that area. Do we do this well? Then we don't need to touch it. Are we struggling with this? Then we need to settle into it. In the same way, if you think about this checklist, the teams that are highly efficient, they have meetings. One of the things I observed with heroic individuals, and I see this on some teams still, is that senior people that used to be individuals and heroic individuals and are now part of a team, they disdain meetings. They avoid meetings. They're like, well, I don't want to come to our staff meeting. I have, I have a rainmaking appointment out there. Highly efficient organizations crave effectively organized meetings, not meetings for the sake of meeting. That's a terrible thing. And I avoid those myself. I will be the first to criticize someone who calls me into a Zoom meeting or a live meeting that could have been done through an email, because my time should be spent client facing. But being able to meet and discuss with my colleagues strategies, issues, workflow challenges, newly emerging opportunities, those are the things that need to be done. And so you look at the highly effective teams, they have weekly meetings that address very tactical issues. They have monthly meetings that address workflow and opportunity and resource issues. They have quarterly meetings where they review their activity and their results and adjust their business model. They have annual meetings where they zoom out and really look at strategy. The other area that we should just touch on briefly, though we certainly have a lot to say about this in other areas, is that these teams have a defined methodology for growing their business, for business acquisition. In fact, one of the things that's emerging again in this world defined by private equity is that private equity funded organizations are now really looking as part of their diligence as to whether or not a team has an institutional methodology for growing as opposed to an entrepreneurial approach to growing. And this deserves let me refine this just a tad here. And I know our time is running by, but in the traditional approach in business, there was a rainmaker or two that ran the business in terms of growth. And they had deep contacts and they were out there connecting with others. And maybe they hired a couple of relationship managers. And oftentimes there was this tension between the rainmaker and the relationship managers. I'm bringing in all the business. I should be compensated, blah, blah, blah. Going forward, when you're a rainmaker and you're the principal of a team and you've monetized your ownership in the team and maybe you're in the process of exiting, all the motivation to do rainmaking is kind of drained out. And now these private equity concerns are saying, wait a second, we're monetizing away the growth engine of what we just bought. That's not sustainable. And so having a methodology is essential. And again, that means the team now, you can look at this and you can say, how do we do in this area, this area, this area? Do we have a reproducible, standard, executable, manageable, understandable, supportable methodology for growing the business? And if we're doing it haphazard, or our methodology is basically hope for some referrals.
Right. Do we have a process or do we have a person, right? I mean, most teams have a person, right? Not a process. And the business has a process that lots of people could come in and operate. But that's the evolution of our industry. We started off with a person. Here's our person, and they're the rainmaker. And this person is the portfolio person. And what you're talking about is that evolution from practice to business is an evolution from people to process.
Exactly. And so for the sake of our model, there's two more pieces that I think bear some consideration. One, I can speak to very briefly. Great teams not only have a methodology for generating new business, but they build advocacy relationships with some of the complementary professionals that they work with. They have close relationships, cross-referral relationships with attorneys and CPAs and other valuation consultants, exit planning consultants, et cetera. They're part of a network. They're part of an ecosystem, not just that they can refer to, which is really important, but also they know how to so engage these folks that they become advocates for the practice. So it becomes an ecosystem that's productive in both directions. That doesn't happen automatically. That has to be set up and built. Again, we have some pretty strong opinions about this and pretty refined approaches for how to do that. But this is, again, an area where a team can look at this and say, how are we doing in that area? Do we have advocates that are referring to us, or is that something we should prioritize? The last piece I would say, and this is something that deserves a lot of attention, but needs to be done very individually, not as a general principle. And that is the fairness of how the productivity of the team is distributed to its members. Everyone on the team has to feel that they're rewarded appropriately for their contribution. Everyone on the team has to feel that they're better being part of this team than being on their own or somewhere else. That doesn't mean that compensation in any way should be necessarily egalitarian, like everyone in every role gets paid very similarly, but it does mean that everyone has to participate in the rewards of the process. If you have a sales assistant that's working 80 hours a week and knocking themselves out and are getting a tiny little sliver of the productivity of the team, that's a problem of unfairness. That's a problem where we're not considering the well-being of each other in the room. Every one of the great teams that I've worked with, every one of them, the senior members of the team, who in many cases are carrying the load of the rainmaking and the visioning and the strategy of the team, are peeling off pieces of their entitlement and distributing them to the people that they're working with in a way that rewards everyone for participating. So the strategic vision of these folks is if we can double our productivity and double our revenue and I'm participating in a slightly less percentage of that double of revenue, I'm still better off. And I've created an environment in which the people I'm working with are excited about coming to work and feel well rewarded and fairly. Now, if you look at these 10 items, and I won't review them here, I'm just going to suggest that if somebody's interested, we have this published in a white paper. Each one of these things gives you an opportunity to say, how are we doing there? Then maybe the team can sit down and look at this and say, okay, of all these things, where would we benefit most from taking action? And obviously, the Advisor Institute, what are we here for? Well, if that's something you want to take action on, at least we have a white paper in that area, or perhaps even some more rich consultation to offer. But the starting point is to think institutionally, to think about our mission and what the business is supposed to be about, and to start thinking critically about how we can make this thing better and more efficient. If you can get to that point, the rest of it is something you can chew through over time.
Well, Ken, I think this has been really valuable. I mean, what you really started with is this deep understanding that this evolution toward a business is a journey. You're going to start off as individual practices operating side by side. And for many of our listeners, that objective is to become that business. And this is not a linear progression. What it is a series of items that need to be worked on and tackled. And I think what the checklist does is just provide a great assessment tool for our listeners to see where they are and where they should spend that very precious time they've got to work on the business. So great job. Hey, as our listeners return to their busy world of running their practices, let me remind you that we love ideas for future podcast topics. If you've got an idea for us, just go to my LinkedIn page, Scott Tatum, or Ken Heyman's LinkedIn page, and message us your idea for a future topic. And that's a wrap on this edition of Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Heyman, the podcast where we explore the science of clients, setting instincts aside so that insights can guide.